Tomorrow, former Vice President Joe Biden is expected to officially jump into the 2020 race for president and shake up an already crowded Democratic field. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, the field of primary challengers against President Trump is not nearly as deep. Only one Republican has stepped up to take on the president. That's former two-term popular Massachusetts Governor Bill Weld. But former Republican Senator Bob Corker says it would be a good idea for the country to see a more robust Republican primary fight.
It would be a good thing for our country should that occur from the standpoint of issues. And that if you had a real primary where you had someone that was really being listened to and of substance, these things that we were talking about, and I could go through a list of them, they would actually be debated in a real way.
Conservative radio host Rush Limbaugh, however, says there's no need for a debate because the Republicans are the party of Trump.
It's the party of Donald Trump right now, and the Republicans that don't realize that had better get on board.
Well, joining me right now is former Massachusetts governor in 2020, a Republican presidential candidate, Bill Weld. Governor, what do you think of Rush Limbaugh acting like he's like King Caucus? He's like the boss who brings the party in, unites his party.
They tried to shut down the First in the Nation primary in New Hampshire. They said we didn't need it, and it should all be for Trump. And that lasted about 1 minute because people in New Hampshire are smart enough to know that about 50% of their clout in this country comes from having the First in the Nation primary. So that went nowhere. But, they're sending out messages from Washington, from the RNC, from Trump headquarters saying, don't let there be any discussion. If anybody representing Bill Weld shows up at a Republican committee meeting, move to adjourn. If that doesn't work, move to table. If that doesn't work, then walk out. They're just terrified there'll be any discussion.
Is it fear or love? What's unite everybody behind Trump right now? 4 out of 5 Republicans.
It's fear. And, I don't know why people should be scared of saying the emperor has no new clothes. But they seem to be.
Well, in an op-ed in the Bulwark today, you write that there's a crisis of trust in this presidency and that it's time for the president to resign. Quote, how can a president function if he instinctively lies to not only the public but to his own staff? There is one essential truth that leaps from the pages of the Mueller report. No one can trust Donald Trump. Resign. Was that a figure of speech? Do you really
it's not
think
a figure
you're calling?
Of speech.
What is it? How would you describe your call for him to resign?
This country would be so much better off with Mike Pence than with Donald Trump that I can't begin to explain the magnitude of that difference. People don't feel normal these days. They feel anxious. Polling shows that people would love a return to normal conditions, what Warren Harding was pleased to call normalcy. But they can't get it as long as Trump is out there sowing division. And, I was right there when President Nixon had to go. And Donald Trump is saying, oh, no, I'm not going to comply with any subpoenas because they're partisan on the other side. That's nothing but a declaration that he's going to refuse to engage. And what he doesn't comprehend is there's law out there. There's a little case called the United States versus Nixon, decided in 1974 in the summer, that says the president is not above the law. And one time, shortly after he left, President Nixon was talking with David Frost, the British journalist, and he said, well, when a president does something, it can't be, and Frost led him on and said it can't be a violation of criminal law if the president does it. Is that right? And President Nixon, former President Nixon, said, well, yes. But he later backed off that position because it's a ludicrous position. It is, however, President Trump's position.
Well, the problem is that ignorance is bliss here, and I think about a president's lacking of any knowledge. Somebody was citing the Federalist Papers a few minutes ago on this program. He doesn't care about the Federalist Papers. He thinks the U.S. Supreme Court can win this thing in some sort of arbitration dispute with the Congress. Where did he get that one from?
Well, I don't know, but if ever there was a political question that the Supreme Court would refuse to touch, it's that one. The congressman from Virginia nailed that one. There's just no basis for saying that, and I don't think the president really cares what's in the Constitution, and I don't think he's going to trouble himself to look. He's just saying, I'm not going to engage with anybody between now and 2020. Okay. I'm simply going to say they're partisan. So he wants to hyper hyperspace Wookiee the extreme antagonism between the D's and the R's that are already there and hope that he wins the coin flip between the D's and the R's in 2020. That's abdicating responsibility.
I have to tell you about my worry right now. I got it from my son today because he has some very interesting observation. He's a smart historian. He told me about the New Hampshire primary ballot. Now, apparently up there in New Hampshire, coming in the next primary up there next winter, you get to choose which ballot you pick up. So a moderate Democrat or a moderate Republican might say, I'm going to vote for Bill Weld against Trump because that's going to really send a bigger message. Or that moderate person could say, you know, I'm going to vote for Joe Biden because I want the Democratic Party to move a little more to the center. If you win, if people do go to you and vote for you against Trump, Biden loses. Is that good for the country?
Well, I don't know. My argument to the voters up there...
It's a good question. I want an answer. What's going to happen up in New Hampshire? Because you've got your best shot up there.
Well, I'll tell you, my argument up there is if you vote for me against Trump, if you don't want 6 more years of Trump, and believe me, that's a scary phrase, 6 more years of Donald Trump. If you don't want that, then if you vote for me against Trump, then you're taking a direct vote against Trump. If you vote for one of 15 remaining candidates in the Democratic Party, there may be many wonderful candidates in that pack, including Joe Biden, with whom I have a long and positive relationship, but there's 15 of them, so it's a more diluted vote against Trump, and you may not guess right.
Okay, I'm going to think that through. I still think you're a danger for Biden because moderates going to like you up there. I know you're popular in Massachusetts, and that's pretty close. Anyway, thank you. Republican presidential candidate Bill Weld.
Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.